Dr. Ford, it is an unbelievable pleasure to be able to be sitting with you here in this incredible institution. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing here? And I want to go back into some of the experiences that you've had that have actually brought you here.
Well, we're here together at IHMC, and that stands for Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. And IHMC is about developing science and technology with the goal of leveraging and extending human performance, including cognition and resilience. So we're about amplifying humans, essentially. We take AI to mean amplified intelligence as opposed to artificial intelligence.
So, amplified intelligence. And what are some of the areas of focus that really, in today's climate, are amplifying it?
Well, one big breakthrough area is AI, which I just mentioned, and allows us to develop technologies that are essentially cognitive orthotics. So I'm looking at you through my ocular orthoses, and it extends my ability to see, it amplifies my ability to see, and we're interested in computational systems that have the same kind of characteristic.
When you think about your own body and how you amplify your personal performance, what are some of the strategies that you employ on a daily basis?
Well, I would say the key strategy for me is diet, and particularly I'm a longtime adherent to a ketogenic diet, and that would be number
Okay,
one.
so why ketogenic? Can you tell me a little bit about why it's meaningful to you personally? And I've heard you started about 40 years ago,
Right, right.
but you look 40, so I'm confused.
Oh, that must be. It must be too much of that powder they put on me. No, yes, I started in '69 or so, maybe '70, and it was with respect to cutting weight to make weight class as a wrestler. And lots of lightweight wrestlers are in ketosis because you're essentially starving and exercising all day. And so most of those folks go in and out of ketosis.
And do they know that?
No.
They don't. Okay.
No, and especially not in my era.
Yeah.
Now, yes. Now, especially at the elite level, like at the NCAA Division I level and at the Olympic level, they're very aware. And they combine the ketogenic diet with amino acid supplementation to allow them to lose weight without losing muscle.
How long do you think the elite athletes in our society have been doing this and being aware of it?
Not long at all. I mean, you see a big change, maybe 5 years at the very top level. So yes, it's a remarkable change.
So you've really looked at it and used it through the lens of athletic performance. And what other attributes do you think this diet provides to you personally?
Well, now at this point in my life, I'm most interested in the effects of the diet as it relates to extended health span and healthy aging. In particular, as we age, more and more of us become increasingly insulin resistant. And most of us are slightly anabolically resistant. And all of this does not augur well for a happy golden years. So sarcopenia, the loss of muscle mass and function, is a huge problem in today's world. And I'm very interested in countermeasures so that one never gets down that rabbit hole, that you avoid it by being strong in your 60s.
Right.
And you have some metabolic currency. You've made some deposits in the bank. So when you're older, you've reserves to draw on. But I think the advantages of the diet are increased as we get older.
That's so fascinating. So metabolic currency. Tell me a little bit more about what you mean, especially as we think about the aging process.
Right. So as we age, many things conspire to make us fatter and weaker and unhealthy. And the ketogenic diet hits a lot of those. It hits maybe 60, 70% of those. So the effects are very broad. There's no drug that would have this broad an effect. And if there was, it would be a bigger seller than Viagra. So it hits a bunch of things. So everyone knows about the energetic aspects of the ketogenic diet.
Right.
You know, the so-called backup fuel, right? But where the action is now in science is mostly on the signaling effects, so the non-energetic effects. And these are very broad. So, for example, the ketogenic diet increases the IGF-1 receptor sensitivity. So as we get older, our anabolic hormones tend to go down.
Right.
But it's not a bad thing if they go down if the sensitivity of the receptors go up.
So let's talk about that. For people, IGF-1 is the insulin growth factors.
Yes, insulin-like growth factor.
And that declines as we get older,
Right.
naturally. And so you're saying that by being on the ketogenic diet, it actually improves the sensitivity of the signaling?
Of the receptors.
Okay.
So you don't need as much circulating IGF-1 to get the same outcome. And this is beautiful.
Wow.
Because IGF-1 is correlated with short lifespan. So high IGF-1 in every animal leads to a shorter lifespan. No IGF-1, extremely low, leads to a short lifespan. It's one of these Goldilocks things. And so ideally, as we age, we'd like low circulating IGF-1, but very high receptor sensitivity, very much like insulin.
Right.
You'd like low insulin, but to be real sensitive to it.
And this ketogenic diet assists with all of those signalings and
Yes, it has widespread and many, I'm sure, not yet discovered signaling effects. Another signaling effect would be that it's an HDAC class 1 inhibitor. So this is a histone deacetylase inhibitor. And to back up a little,
yes.
we all know that exercise is good for our brains. And one of the ways it's good for our brains is it increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, right? BDNF.
Okay.
And exercise increases it. It was recently learned, in fact, I think it was just last year, that this happens largely through beta-hydroxybutyrate. So when beta-hydroxybutirate's elevated, I mentioned it's an inhibitor, it's a class 1 inhibitor of HDACs, and HDACs are an inhibitor of BDNF. So you're inhibiting the inhibitor. So that's one of the things that we're going to study here,
Oh, interesting.
is to what extent can exogenous ketones, like a ketone ester,
Right.
elevate BDNF, and then would that be helpful for people with traumatic brain injury or for other folks that need to have a elevated BDNF?
And that's really such cutting edge new science. You said you're going to be studying it here. Is that going to be in the coming year?
This year, and we're excited about that. The signaling effects are really exciting.
So for people who are watching this and are not elite athletes and have heard that the ketogenic diet is hard to do, hard to get into, there's something called keto flu, all of these sort of things, what would you recommend to someone who's in their 50s and their 60s that are just starting to understand that we can go from being, the way I look at it is like we can either be sugar burners. I know for myself, I was always burning sugar as my main source of fuel, and it created such a vicious cycle for my health, my autoimmune health, and so much. And once I learned that I could just switch over
Right.
to high fat and even into ketogenic, and definitely there's a difference, and I want you to talk about that. It transformed my whole world and my energy, my focus, everything, and now you're sharing so much more. What would be the first steps that you would encourage someone like in their 50s or 60s to take to jump into this lifestyle?
Well, first thing I'd suggest is they do some learning, and they buy some books, and they listen to some podcasts, and they get up to speed, and they find out who are the folks they trust and have confidence in to tell them about the diet. You're right, there's a big difference between just generally eating high fat and being in a ketogenic state. And there's a lot of confusion about this. So one could eat a ketogenic diet and have it be very unhealthy.
Right.
You could just, drink seed oil, and you'd be in ketosis, but you'd not be doing well.
Right.
And so by definition, a ketogenic diet is one that elevates beta-hydroxybutyrate above about 0.6 millimolars. So that's the definition. But you could achieve that in all kinds of ways, from really healthy ways to really unhealthy ways.
What are the top healthy ways that you think people can achieve it?
Well, items like avocado. I like oily fish very much.
We were talking about eating sushi last night,
Yes.
and just tell us a little bit about what you add to your sushi.
Well, Nancy, my wife, she keeps a small vial of medium chain triglyceride oil in her purse, and that's for when we want sushi. So if it's just ordinary sushi, not to say bad sushi, but non-remarkable sushi, like for example maguro, a tuna, a few drops of medium chain triglyceride oil make it have the mouthfeel and the richness that you would anticipate in an expensive, like a Toro tuna. So I'm sure the sushi guy was like, "What is that guy doing?" Yeah,
But it's easy, right? Like you said, you can keep
easy.
it. I keep my MCTs in my purse.
Good.
I travel around with some avocados and macadamia nuts and things like that,
Yeah.
just as a base. And so MCTs, avocados. What
Yeah.
else?
Canned sardines. I'm a big fan of grass-fed beef.
Yes.
I love fish. Living in Pensacola, we're chock-a-block with fish. And so that's wonderful. With fish, say, with a nice high-quality olive oil on the fish. It can be a wonderful diet. And if you do it for a while, it becomes easier, and you no longer are at all interested in the bread bowl, or when they offer you a sugary dessert, it doesn't seem appealing. It seems semi-gross.
Isn't that the strangest thing?
It is.
For me, I never thought there would be a day that I would actually feel that. But tell us a little bit about why we could look at a sugary dessert and almost, not be interested or think it's gross.
Well, humans are remarkable in that regard, and literally our taste changes. So if we don't ingest sugar, things that you would not have previously regarded as sweet seem slightly sweet, and things that you would have regarded as sweet in the past now seem really too sweet. So most ice creams, for example, to me seem exceptionally sweet.
How long do you think it takes for us to get to that place where our taste buds start to change?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's probably very individual, and probably depends a lot on how focused they are in maintaining a really low sugar intake.
Why is it that it's taken us as a society so long to start to begin to see what a ketogenic diet can do for us? What do you think went wrong? Just curious about your perspective on that.
Well, I think our forebears, even as recently as our grandparents, they ate a lot of fat. Now, they mostly weren't in ketosis, but they were big fat eaters. And they were remarkably not fat themselves. I think one of the challenges is for the recent last, say, 30 or 40 years, particularly emanating from the United States and then spreading around the world, we've been essentially fat phobic. So fat has been demonized to a remarkable extent. And people literally think if they eat fat, they'll be fat. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. There are some fats that are bad for us, but these are typically quite unnatural fats that we had to use industrial processes to produce. I think another thing that holds the ketogenic diet back to some extent is calling it a diet.
Right.
So diet sounds like something temporary and short term, and we all know that diets don't typically work. And so then it gets connected to words like fad. And you
Yes.
say, well, this is why we're still here as a species. It can't be a fad. Humans would not exist without the ability to produce ketones. The biggest threat to the human species over most of our evolution was starvation. And we would starve in a day or two, say 2 days, without ketones, because your brain would be derived of glucose, your brain would be destroyed, and you would die. And that's the reason we have this mechanism. So it's a beautiful thing, but it's not a fad, unless you think since the beginning of humanity is a fad. And then I think another problem is because you're changing something at the most fundamental level, you're changing function at the cellular level, how we produce energy, and a wide range of signaling effects, the ketogenic diet sounds almost like snake oil. Because what doesn't it do? right? I mean,
Right.
if you talk to advocates, there are people who will address 20 different benefits, and that's very unlikely in general. So people are naturally quite skeptical, and I think that's also worked against it.
So if we were to change the vernacular, what kind of terms would you see as really what would work to communicate something that we need so desperately, not just in this country, but globally?
Yes, it's probably a very natural way of eating, and people probably for most of human history drifted in and out of ketosis. So they would hunt and gather, and then finally get a big kill. And they didn't have refrigerators, so they ate it all. And that might have knocked them out of ketosis, and then they would go back in. And it's probably a very natural process. But I think the word diet in our culture brings a lot of baggage.
Yes.
When I say ketogenic diet, I really mean a way of eating that elevates your circulating beta hydroxybutyrate level to a sufficient level. And typically that's thought to be 0.5 or 0.6 millimolars. So that can be done well or very badly.
My son had seizures, and so at a very young age, we got him into eating high fat, and I was very frightened because we thought we were going to actually lose him from a particular seizure that he had, and from that day forward, we've changed the way that he's eaten, and he's in the 99 percentile for height. I mean, he is filled with energy and vitality. But it's so counterintuitive. So for the parents out there that have children that may be having seizures and may or may not know about the ketogenic diet, what are your thoughts there?
I think it's really key to have a physician that you have high confidence in and who's well educated on this matter. So in the United States, Johns Hopkins University has been pioneering ketogenic diets for epileptic children for many decades.
Yeah, it's like close to 100 years now.
Quite long, and it goes back way before that. So in ancient times, even in the times of the ancient Greeks and Romans, when children were having seizures, bad seizures, grand mal seizures, they were typically taken and locked up with only water in padded sort of room. And this seemed very cruel, and the kids didn't like it, and the parents really didn't like it. But the seizures would stop.
Yeah.
And that's because with no food, you go into ketosis, and the ketones prevented the seizures.
And was there a recognition of what was happening? No, it was just they'll stop
Yeah.
if they just
Starve a seizure.
Yeah,
you know.
starve a seizure. And I guess in today's environment, we're still looking at it through that lens, but recognizing that a ketogenic diet or a ketogenic lifestyle can do the same thing.
The key is, I think, that gets overlooked a lot is a quality, well-educated, open-minded physician. And that used to be nearly the null set when it came to ketogenic diets. I have a friend, in fact, he was on the board of directors here, and he had glioblastoma. And when I talked to his physicians, this was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, about the ketogenic diet, and not suggesting that it would cure him, but it was certainly could be helpful. The physician literally gasped and exclaimed that this is terribly dangerous. Well, this gentleman has glioblastoma.
Right.
Right? His life expectancy, the physician had told me, was 14 months. So they're more terrified of the diet than they were of glioblastoma. That tells you a lot.
How long do you think it's going to take for us to hit that tipping point where there's an understanding of the benefits of a ketogenic diet?
I think it's happening now much
do.
faster than it has in earlier periods of my life, these kinds of changes, mostly driven by the internet, and the patients are driving it. They're going into the physician's offices and saying, hey, look, I lost 40 pounds. And they say, well, how'd you do that? And you tell them. And oh, look, my triglycerides are better. Well, how'd you do that? And you tell them. And they say, oh, that can't be why. But many are saying, I need to look into this. And also because the research world now is really on this. So there are hundreds of researchers looking into the ketogenic diet from every angle. I think the physicians are feeling less timid about talking about it.
Yeah.
So I'm optimistic. Typically, translation from research to clinical practice takes 15 to 20 years. It's a long time.
It is.
Nobody has that long to wait.
I was having dinner a couple of weeks ago with my friend and someone you know, Dr. Steve Anton, and he had spent the day with you. And I think he was telling me a little bit about how he ate like you did that day.
Yeah.
And he thought that it would be no problem because he believed that he was fat adapted
Right.
and is a researcher and very excited about this topic. But he didn't do that well on your diet. Can you
Yeah.
just give us an overview of what an average day for you looks like as far as the amount of fat you're consuming?
Yeah, he had a little bit of a rough day.
Yeah.
It was just an ordinary day here. So
Yeah.
many of us here eat the ketogenic diet. So I think for lunch, we had pork belly with scallops on it, and arugula, and olive oil, and maybe some other stuff. And for dinner, I think we might have had soft shell crabs. Oh, and we had lamb neck, and that was very fatty and good. And then and some other items, it was like a 4-course meal. And then for dessert, we had what we call here keto cream. So it's a kind of ice cream that our chef makes, and it's made out of Irish butter, Kerrygold butter, medium chain triglycerides, lots, egg yolks,
Yum.
vanilla, a little splash of citrus, and it's just fabulous. And it's very rich and unctuous. And he had a bowl of that. That's a huge fat bomb.
Yeah, that's a lot, like 20 fat bombs.
Yeah, but it's really good.
Yeah, I want to make it today.
should.
I'm going to take that recipe.
I'm having some tomorrow night.
You are?
Traditionally, for dessert, we serve keto cream.
Oh, that's so cool. So on average, like in that particular day, how many grams of fat do you think you're consuming?
Oh, I don't know. I no longer think much about
Right.
it because I've been doing it so long. It's just natural. I kind of know how much.
Right.
If anything, I keep a closer eye on the amount of protein I consume.
Tell us why.
Well, I'm not as afraid of protein as many people. So a lot of longevity experts deeply fear protein, and I don't. Also, a lot of ketogenic folks fear protein because if you eat a lot of it, it will take you out of ketosis, but you would have to eat a tremendous amount. And especially if you've been doing the diet as long as I have, it does not take you out. Further, as we age, we need to consume more protein, not less.
Right.
So if you think of granny and grandpa, they don't eat any protein. They eat like a little piece of toast with maybe with some jam on it, and sweet things. The very worst thing they could be eating. Because if you want to maintain mobility and strength as we age, our protein requirements go up.
Right.
And so it's important to be aware of that.
There's always a question with the ketogenic diet that, yes, you're going to lose weight, but are you losing muscle? Are you losing fat? Tell us a little bit about that.
You're mostly losing fat if you do it well. So when you're cutting weight on a ketogenic diet, I think an ordinary person should do what the wrestlers do and have amino acids with it. So if you are ingesting amino acid supplements like essential amino acids or
Right.
branched chain amino acids, and you're ketogenic, the vast majority of the weight you will lose will be fat. And I think this is an important thing to appreciate. When people are on these yo-yo diets, they dump a bunch of weight, and with that, they dumped a bunch of muscle. A lot of it's muscle. And as you lose muscle, you process glucose worse, you become more insulin resistant, because muscle is a primary store of glycogen. So you're in a vicious cycle, and then you gain the weight back, plus some more. So when you lose weight, it's important to maintain as much muscle as you can.
And the best ways to maintain muscle as you're losing fat, because as you mentioned, you're dropping the fat on a ketogenic diet. The best ways are to consume the essential amino acids.
Yes, I think so, and exercise. Exercise and consume the amino acids along with the diet. I think that's
Right.
good advice.
The reason that people are concerned about the high protein, is it because of the fact that carbohydrates and protein are not neutral macros, and so that they can transform if there's not enough of one?
Well, in the case of protein, I
Yeah.
think there are two boogeymen in the room. One is it was long thought, and many people still think this, that protein is remarkably hard on your kidneys and that if you eat a lot of protein, you might damage them. This has turned out not to be true, except for people with pre-existing disease. The other sort of boogeyman in the room is mTOR and IGF-1. So I mentioned earlier that as we age, we become not just insulin resistant, but anabolically resistant, meaning resistant to anabolic hormones and to stimulants that normally would cause an anabolic response. And there's a lot of fear about having elevated mTOR signaling and high IGF-1 because in nematodes and every kind of animal we've looked at, that's associated with shorter lifespan. So when you think about protein, just eating protein stimulates mTOR. And you want to stimulate mTOR, in my view, intermittently, because that is the key, that's the spark that starts muscle protein synthesis. So you maintain muscle and recovery in skin as you age. If you have no protein, well, it would be very rough.
Yeah.
But you don't want mTOR always elevated. You want it intermittently elevated. And I think that's a big, big difference and a point of confusion. Another thing to bear in mind is that a ketogenic diet elevates mTOR in a tissue-specific way. So when you hear people talk about mTOR is terrible, Okay, circulating mTOR is probably not good. If it's a very high level, you've activated mTOR all day long. That's not how it works. For example, exercise elevates mTOR, but nobody would tell you that exercise is bad for you, right? And it does it very much in the same way the diet does. It does it in a tissue-specific way. So if you put mice, for example, on a ketogenic diet and look at their livers, mTOR is actually, activation is reduced, which is what you would like. But in the muscle, it's increased.
It's interesting to hear the two boogeymen because there is so much discussion right now about protein
There
and
is.
what the right levels are. And
And I think as we age, they need to go up, not down.
there's a lot of science pointing to that.
Yes.
Definitely, I agree. So just going back a little bit, has it been like a therapeutic state of ketosis that you've been in throughout the years?
I typically stay around 1 to 3 millimolars.
Okay.
And I get my best effects around 2 and up.
Okay. So
especially-
for the audience, tell us a little bit about the different states of ketosis, like what constitutes therapeutic and
Well, for different disorders, they have
Yeah.
postulated various levels of ketosis that are hoped to be therapeutic. For a cancer patient, for example, they're looking at quite high levels of ketosis, 3 to 5 millimolars typically. But for health, it doesn't need to be that high. For general health, I think any reasonable level, I like frequently to go over 2 millimolar. I think that's where I get the best advantage, but 1.5 is fine with me.
And you, over all these years, you can probably just feel what it feels like to be at the different levels.
I can,
Yeah.
but I do a lot of finger prick
You
blood
do?
testing.
Do you
I
have
like
a certain?
to do it. Yeah.
You do?
I like to do it because then I say, ha ha. And I like to check. My fingers don't like it. I like to check.
How often do you check?
It depends. So for the last few days, I haven't checked because I've been at the University of Florida and very busy. But typically, I check a good bit. I like to check before a strenuous workout, for example. So I make sure that I'm pretty high before I do, say, heavy weightlifting.
Because of the advantage you get when you do that?
Yeah, I feel better. I feel better. I feel more energetic. I think my performance is a little better. Could be psychological. When you feel better, you do better.
Right.
And I feel more turned on in terms of cognition and when the ketones are a little higher.
Right. Do you have a specific type of testing device that you like to use?
I like the Abbott Labs device. It's simple, pretty reliable.
Yeah.
It's a good device.
That's great. So, if you get out of ketosis, and I'm sure your metabolic flexibility is so remarkable. We were talking about some of the foods that you can eat because your body is accustomed to sort of going between the different sources of fuel. If you go out of ketosis, how do you feel? What do you sort of do at that point?
If I just drift a little bit out, I don't feel a lot, maybe suboptimal.
Right.
For example, I spend a lot of time in Italy, and I am quite disciplined, and I do not eat the pasta.
Wow.
And one day, my wife and I decided to ask the restaurant to make half a bowl of pasta, and she could have half, and I'd have half. So we'd each have a quarter bowl, and it ruined the whole day for me. I had to go back to the hotel and had a headache and didn't feel good. So I think, I've greased the skids for all these years toward a fat metabolism. And I think this was a shock to the system. Whereas normally I was probably down to zero ketones after that meal, or very low, zero point 0.2 maybe.
Yeah.
I didn't test. I should have, just for
It would
curiosity.
be interesting.
Yeah.
Are there people that should not go into ketosis or should not exercise in that way?
Well, for certain diabetics, I think it's a godsend for almost all diabetics.
Right.
But many cases, it should be physician supervised. Because as you go into ketosis and you get into pretty profound level of ketosis, the need for insulin will drop rapidly and often go to zero. So if you're still injecting the insulin and you don't have a need for the insulin, this can be very dangerous. So it's important for diabetics to do it very carefully I think, with physician supervision in most cases. There's a company, Virta, that this is their entire business. They work with type 2 diabetics, and they are able to move most of them completely off insulin. But they do it gradually, and they make sure that these people are safe as they do it. But it's a wonderful thing.
It's really remarkable. With almost half the country pre-diabetic or diabetic.
Yeah, it's incredible. And in a way, it's kind of nice that all of this interest in ketones, I mean, nobody ever talked about ketones, ever.
I know.
And you didn't bring it up in polite company. Like if you started blathering about beta-hydroxybutyrate at dinner, you get the nerd hat, right? And now people ask me all the time, oh, what do you think?
Right.
And I think the timing is perfect. If there was ever a time that humanity could benefit from being leaner and healthier, it's now. I fly a lot, and the airport is a shocking place.
Yeah. It's very hard to see what we have in our communities, in our environment, but then we look at the food that is available. It's a no-win situation.
No, go to a hospital.
Right.
And they have the worst food of all.
How does that happen?
incredible.
Like, how does that happen?
It's incredible. I just learned that the Barrow Institute in Phoenix, it's a premier neurologic disorder institute, is now one of the diets they're going to offer is a ketogenic diet.
Oh, wow. Good, good.
That's a good
Starting to move in the right direction. You do a lot of work with different parts of the government. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, IHMC does a lot of research for the government, mostly for NASA and the Department of Defense, but also for the NIH, the National Institute of Health, and the National Science Foundation, and all the other usual suspects, the Army, Navy. And then on top of that, we encourage each other to do advisory kind of work for the agencies, where you do science advisory work, you serve on panels, and you try to help steer science and technology in a productive direction.
What are some of the things that you've been focused on, and where have you been steering?
Well, one of my main areas of interest over the years has been NASA. I've worked with them for many years. I was at NASA myself in the 90s, and I served as chairman of the NASA Science Advisory Council, which was a great experience and a privilege. I also served on the National Science Board, which is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And as you know, that can be an interesting process. And the Defense Science Board, which is the science board that advises the Secretary of Defense on science matters, and some others.
So these science matters that you're advising on, that you're really helping to steer the way science is being viewed and where we focus. Tell us a little bit about that.
What's an interesting process because you have a room full of people, typically well opinionated with well-adjusted egos, and you end up having a lot of dialogue, and you try to come to a consensus on a particular matter before the board. And it's not always easy. People have different perspectives, but it's typically an interesting process. You know, in the case of the National Science Board, it's a little different than the others because that board is not just advisory, it's also the policy board for the National Science Foundation. The other boards are advisory, which I love. So at the end of the day, you say, well, here's my best advice, and they can ignore it or act on it. It's worth what they paid for it.
So when we talk about the food guidelines and where the emphasis is, how do you view that? And where do you see us going with those, especially based on what you know from both a scientific point of view as well as a personal experience with the ketogenic diet?
Well, those guidelines come from one such board. And the effectiveness of these boards depend critically on who appoints them and what kind of people are put on them, and that they're free of conflict of interest. So that's very important. In the case of the food guidelines, it's tough for a panel or a board to suddenly reverse years and years of recommendations all at once. So you can see a little progress over the last 10 or 15 years. Recently, there's been a little progress. But essentially, the food pyramid remains largely inverted, in my view.
Right.
It is better than it was until recently, and I think it will continue to move better as they feel pressure to change and as the science piles up. But it's important to appreciate that these boards are staffed by humans who have other day jobs
Right.
that often require funding from the government, and you often know what the right answer is, and you don't want to give the wrong answer. So it puts you under a lot of pressure if you're going to go against the status quo and you serve on one of these panels.
So we talked a little bit about the tipping point for, the conversations at dinner to really be open to what we were talking about and understanding that. Fat doesn't make us fat.
No, I don't know how long it will take, but
Yeah.
it's way faster than it would have been without the internet and without all the media that it's enabled.
Yeah.
So that's changed a lot.
Right. And how does that, from your vantage point, which is truly remarkable, how does that influence the pressures that these different groups, boards are experiencing as we try to, and from my point of view, change
Sure.
that inverted pyramid?
Well, they feel pressure and they receive communications. People show up at the board meetings and ask to testify. The internet has allowed people all over the world, and particularly all over the United States, to strongly engage in areas that would have been invisible for them. These kind of things, people wouldn't have access to it.
Right.
And so the internet is one of those mixed blessings, as all technologies are. It's essentially neutral, and it depends, it's certainly ethically neutral. It depends on how wise we are in our use of it. So this is one of the good uses, in my view.
So showing up, putting the pressure, using,
Sharing the science. The internet allows rapid sharing of science.
right,
If you think what it was like, even very recently, you would spend days in the library to find only a few papers that were relevant to what you were working on. And then the rest you had to wait for, and they would come by mail from libraries all over the country through interlibrary loans. And it was a very slow process. That's what graduate students were for. It took
Right.
all day to just get a collection of the right papers. But now they zip around on the internet. People post them on Facebook.
isn't it true?
Big change.
Thank you for sharing a wealth of goodness, 40 years of experience and research and really leading our minds in the direction that will make us healthier, better performers and so much more. It's a true honor to be able to sit here with you and have this experience.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be involved in this movie, and I appreciate it.
You know, I'm so really excited about the fact that you've mixed up throughout this entire series all the experts that we're talking to. Ben Greenfield, known author, radio personality, but he's a person who walks the walk, right?
Yes, Ben Greenfield is an incredibly interesting guy. This guy is a Spartan racer. He's a world-class athlete. He brings the most interesting biohacking information to all the thought leaders. He's like a thought leader of the thought leaders.
And see, when you say terms like biohacking, people at home are going, what does she mean by that?